The small town of Oakridge had always been a quiet place. Nestled in the foothills of a sprawling forest, the town seemed like it was frozen in time, a place where nothing much ever happened, and everyone knew each other's business. The kind of town where doors were rarely locked, neighbors waved at each other as they passed by, and gossip spread faster than the morning fog that rolled in off the hills. But in the fall of 2023, Oakridge was rocked by a scandal and a crime so brutal, so unexpected that it left the entire community shaken. Derek Coleman was a man who had lived in Oakridge his entire life. In his early 50s, Derek had built a reputation in the town as a hard worker. He ran a successful contracting business, specializing in home repairs and construction. He was the kind of man people called when their roof leaked or their deck needed fixing, reliable, dependable, someone who kept his head down and got the job done. His hands were rough, calloused from years of manual labor, but his quiet demeanor made him easy to trust. People often said Derek was a man of few words, but when he spoke, he meant what he said. Derek's life had taken a turn 8 years ago when he married Rachel Matthews. Rachel had moved to Oakridge from a nearby town after the death of her first husband in a tragic car accident. She was 10 years younger than Derek, a kind and nurturing woman who quickly became part of the Oakridge community. Everyone liked Rachel. She had a gentle warmth about her that made people feel at ease. She opened a small boutique in town and seemed to thrive, even after the heartbreak of losing her first husband. When Derek and Rachel married, Rachel brought her son, Ethan, into the relationship. Ethan had been 16 at the time, young, impressionable, and still grieving the loss of his father. Derek had tried to bond with Ethan, but their relationship had always been tense, strained by the complexities of a stepfather and stepson trying to find their footing in each other's lives. Ethan had never fully accepted Derek, and over time, Derek stopped trying. By the time Ethan was in his mid-20s, living at home with Derek and Rachel, the distance between him and Derek had grown. Ethan was charismatic, attractive, and well-liked around town. He had a way with people that Derek could never quite understand. While Derek was quiet and reserved, Ethan was bold, confident, and seemingly untouchable. The women in town doted on him, and the men envied his charm. But there was something about Ethan that always unsettled Derek, a sense that Ethan was hiding something beneath his perfect exterior, something Derek couldn't quite put his finger on. As the months passed, Derek began to notice things, small, almost imperceptible changes in the dynamics of the household. Rachel and Ethan seemed to be spending more and more time together, laughing at private jokes, whispering in low tones when they thought Derek wasn't around. Derek tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to paranoia. After all, Rachel was Ethan's mother. It was normal for them to be close. But as the summer of 2023 turned to fall, the tension in the house became impossible to ignore. Derek's suspicions were gnawing at him, keeping him up at night, twisting his gut with anxiety. He couldn't help but feel like something was terribly wrong. Rachel had become more distant, more secretive. She no longer confided in Derek the way she used to. She would get up in the middle of the night, slipping out of bed with whispered excuses about insomnia, and Derek would lie awake, listening to the soft creak of the stairs as she made her way downstairs. Sometimes, a few minutes later, he would hear Ethan's footsteps as well. For months, Derek had convinced himself that he was being paranoid, that his insecurities about Rachel being younger, more beautiful, were clouding his judgment. But in his heart, he knew. He knew that something was happening right under his nose, something he couldn't ignore any longer. On the night of October 14th, 2023, Derek lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The clock on the nightstand read 11:43 p.m. The house was quiet, but Derek's mind was racing, replaying the events of the past few months over and over again, like a broken record. Rachel was lying beside him, her breathing slow and steady, but Derek could tell she wasn't asleep. He had learned to recognize the subtle difference in her breathing when she was awake, lost in her own thoughts. At 11:46 p.m., Rachel quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Derek. She padded across the room, her bare feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. Derek listened as she opened the door and made her way downstairs. His heart pounded in his chest, the familiar sense of dread washing over him. This wasn't the first time Rachel had done this, getting up in the middle of the night and disappearing downstairs. But tonight, something felt different. Derek waited for a moment, his breath shallow, his mind racing. Then, a few minutes later, he heard it. Ethan's footsteps, soft but unmistakable, moving toward the kitchen. It was happening again. Derek got out of bed, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't bother turning on the lights. The darkness felt fitting, like a cloak, hiding the ugliness of what he was about to uncover. He crept down the stairs, stopping just outside the kitchen. The light was on, casting a warm glow into the hallway, and he could hear their voices, Rachel's, soft and anxious, and Ethan's, low and reassuring. At 11:52 p.m., Derek stood in the shadows, listening to the conversation that would change everything. "Ethan, we can't keep doing this," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "He's going to figure it out." Ethan's reply was calm, confident. "He won't. He's too wrapped up in his own world to notice. We've been careful. Besides, what's he going to do? He's not going to leave you. He's too weak." Derek's blood ran cold, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his body shaking with rage. The confirmation of his worst fears hit him like a punch to the gut. For months, he had suspected that Rachel and Ethan were hiding something from him, but hearing it out loud, hearing the betrayal in their voices, made it real in a way he wasn't prepared for. At 11:58 p.m., Derek turned and silently climbed back up the stairs. His mind was racing, his thoughts chaotic. He had to do something, but he couldn't confront them yet. Not without proof. He needed more than just suspicions. He needed to catch them in the act. By the time Derek reached the bedroom, it was midnight. Rachel's phone was sitting on the nightstand, where she had left it earlier that evening. Derek stared at it for a moment, his hands trembling. He had never gone through her phone before. It felt wrong, invasive, but after what he had just heard, Derek knew he couldn't trust her anymore. At 12:03 a.m., Derek picked up Rachel's phone and entered the passcode, a series of numbers he had seen her enter hundreds of times without thinking twice. The screen unlocked, and Derek's heart pounded as he opened her messaging app. His fingers scrolled through the list of conversations, searching for Ethan's name. When he found it, his worst fears were confirmed. The messages between Rachel and Ethan were casual at first, filled with inside jokes and playful banter. But as Derek scrolled further back, the tone shifted. The messages became flirty, suggestive, filled with words that no mother and son should be saying to each other. There were photos, too, selfies taken late at night, when Derek had been asleep. There were plans for secret meetings, stolen moments, and lies told to cover their tracks. At 12:07 a.m., Derek sat on the edge of the bed, his hands shaking as he read through the messages. Each word felt like a knife twisting deeper into his chest. He could barely breathe. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. But one thing was clear. Rachel and Ethan had been betraying him for months, and they thought they could get away with it. Derek put the phone down carefully, his movements almost mechanical. He stood up, his body numb, his heart pounding in his ears. He had seen enough. He had the proof he needed. It was time to confront them. At 12:15 a.m., Derek descended the stairs once again, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He no longer cared about being quiet. He wanted them to hear him coming. He wanted them to know that their secret was out, that there would be no more lies, no more hiding. When he entered the kitchen, Rachel and Ethan were sitting at the table, talking in low voices. They both looked up when Derek appeared in the doorway, their expressions a mix of surprise and fear. Rachel's face went pale, her eyes wide with panic. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed more annoyed than afraid. "How long?" Derek asked, his voice low and cold. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "How long has this been going on?" Derek's voice rose, his fists clenched at his sides. "Don't lie to me. I know everything. I've seen the messages. I've seen the photos." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Derek, please, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. We didn't mean to hurt you." Ethan stood up slowly, placing himself between Derek and Rachel. "You need to calm down, Derek," he said, his voice steady but laced with condescension. "This isn't what you think. You're overreacting." Derek's laugh was bitter, filled with a rage he could barely contain. Overreacting? I've been living in a house with my wife and stepson, and you've both been lying to me for months. You've been sleeping with each other behind my back, and you think I'm overreacting? Ethan's expression hardened. Look, Derek, it's not about you. Rachel wasn't happy with you. She hasn't been happy for a long time. Maybe you should have noticed that. Derek's vision blurred with fury. The audacity of Ethan's words, the arrogance in his tone, made Derek's blood boil. Without thinking, Derek lunged at Ethan, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. You think you can just take her from me? Derek growled, his face inches from Ethan's. You think you can just do this and get away with it? Rachel screamed, rushing forward to pull Derek off of Ethan, but Derek shoved her back, his focus entirely on the younger man. Ethan shoved back, his face twisted with anger. Get your hands off me, old man, Ethan spat. You're pathetic. She doesn't want you anymore. Derek's rage reached a boiling point. He stepped back, his eyes darting to the counter where a heavy cast-iron skillet sat. Without a second thought, he grabbed it, the weight of it solid in his hands. Derek, stop! Rachel's voice was frantic, but it was too late. At 12:27 a.m., Derek swung the skillet with all his strength, the sound of metal connecting with bone filling the kitchen. Ethan's head snapped to the side, his body collapsing to the floor with a sickening thud. Rachel screamed, falling to her knees beside Ethan, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the blood pouring from his head. But Derek wasn't finished. He raised the skillet again, his mind cold and calculating, and brought it down on Ethan's head once more, and again, and again. By 12:32 a.m., Ethan was no longer moving. His body lay in a pool of blood, his face unrecognizable. Rachel was sobbing beside him, her hands covered in blood, her voice broken and pleading, Derek, please stop, please. But Derek couldn't hear her. He couldn't feel anything anymore. The rage, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it had all melted away, leaving only emptiness behind. He dropped the skillet, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing through the kitchen, and stepped back, his breathing heavy, his hands stained with blood. At 12:57 a.m., the house was silent. Rachel sat on the floor, cradling Ethan's lifeless body, her sobs echoing through the empty kitchen. The blood on her hands had dried, the reality of what had just happened sinking in like a weight she could never lift. Derek stood by the doorway, staring at the scene before him, his mind blank. The man he had been just hours ago was gone. The husband, the stepfather, the man who had worked so hard to build a life with Rachel. That man no longer existed. In his place was someone cold, someone detached from the horror he had just unleashed. For a moment, Derek wondered if he should stay and face the consequences of what he had done. But then he realized there was no point. The damage was done. The family he had tried so hard to keep together was shattered, and there was no going back. At 1:02 a.m., Derek walked out the front door, the cool night air hitting his face like a slap. He stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The street was quiet, the houses dark, everyone else in the world still asleep, blissfully unaware of the tragedy that had just unfolded. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what came next. But one thing was certain. He couldn't stay here. By 7 a.m., Oakridge was waking up to the news of the crime that had rocked their small town. Police cars lined the street outside Derek and Rachel's house, their lights flashing in the early morning light. The neighbors had heard the screams, the sounds of violence, and had called 911. What the first responders found when they arrived was a scene of horror. Rachel was still in the kitchen, covered in blood, her voice hoarse from hours of sobbing. Ethan's body lay beside her, cold, lifeless, his head beaten beyond recognition. Derek was gone, nowhere to be found. The investigation began immediately. It didn't take long for the police to piece together what had happened. The messages on Rachel's phone, the blood-stained skillet, Rachel's hysterical account of the events, it all pointed to one thing. Derek had killed Ethan in a fit of rage, driven by jealousy and betrayal. For the next several hours, Oakridge was abuzz with speculation. How could this have happened? Derek Coleman, a man they had all known for years, had snapped, murdering his stepson in cold blood. The town's quiet streets, normally filled with the sounds of children playing and birds chirping, were now filled with the whispers of neighbors trying to make sense of the tragedy. At 12:57 p.m. on December 8, 2023, Derek Coleman stood before the judge in the Oakridge courthouse, his face impassive as he awaited his fate. The trial had been swift. His confession, the overwhelming evidence, the witnesses who had heard the commotion that night. There was no question of his guilt. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension, as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Derek Coleman, you are hereby found guilty of the murder of Ethan Matthews. You are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Derek didn't flinch. He had known this was coming from the moment he had left the house that night. There was no regret in his eyes, no sign of remorse. He had done what he felt he had to do. The betrayal, the lies, the months of torment. He had put an end to it in the only way he knew how. Rachel sat in the back of the courtroom, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She had lost everything: her son, her husband, her entire life in Oakridge. The weight of her choices, the guilt that would haunt her for the rest of her life, was almost unbearable. As the gavel struck, sealing Derek's fate, the town of Oakridge fell silent. The story would spread, the whispers growing louder as people tried to make sense of the tragedy that had unfolded in their quiet little town. But the truth was simple. In the end, it was a story of love, betrayal, and revenge, a story that had ended in bloodshed and broken lives. The sun rose over Oakridge the morning after the trial, casting long shadows over the streets that had once seemed so peaceful. The town was forever changed, haunted by the events of that October night. Derek Coleman would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and Rachel would carry the weight of her guilt for as long as she lived. In the end, no one had won. There were only the ruins of what had once been, a broken family, a shattered town, and the echoes of a crime that would never be forgotten. And as the years passed, Oakridge would always remember the night that tore one family apart, a night that revealed the darkness hiding behind closed doors, and the lengths one man would go to for revenge.